Hello and welcome. This is a quick revision series of 50 most important topics of polity and governance for UPSC mains. The series is designed to holistically cover the polity and governance part, which is a major portion of our GS2 syllabus. Our first topic is separation of power, which is directly mentioned in our GS2 syllabus. In this video, we will understand what is meant by the doctrine of separation of power, Indian constitution position on separation of powers, significance of the concept, what is meant by functional overlap and system of checks and balance, relevant Supreme Court judgments, and a PYQ on this topic. So without any further delays, let's get started. Firstly, what is meant by separation of power? The doctrine of separation of power claims that the state power is not vested in a single authority, but is divided among various organs of the state. As we know, there are three different organs of the state, that is, the legislature, executive, and the judiciary. The role of the legislature is to make the laws, while executive is there to implement the laws. On the other hand, judiciary is there to check upon the constitutional validity of the laws. Now, let's understand the position of Indian state on separation of power. Before moving further, I would like to mention the separation of power can be of two types. That is, complete separation of power and partial separation of power. While complete separation of power is neither possible nor desirable, on the other hand, partial separation of power is required to achieve balanced constitutional structure. This partial separation of power is also called as weak separation of power. Now, as I explained what is meant by weak separation of power, you will better understand when I will say that Indian state represent a contemporary approach which advocates weaker separation of power with checks and balances in constitutionalizing the doctrine of separation of power. Now, what is meant by checks and balances, we will see in a while. Now, let's try to understand the constitutional position on separation of power. Though the constitution provides for the idea of separation of power, the phrase separation of power is nowhere mentioned in the constitution. It is only in the implied manner. We'll see through the relevant articles how the constitutional embraces the idea of separation of power. Firstly, Article 50 of Indian Constitution talks about the separation of judiciary from the executive. It says that state shall take steps to separate the judiciary from the executive. Article 121 and 211 says that the judicial conduct of Supreme Court and High Court cannot be discussed in Parliament and state legislature. Further, Article 122 and 215 says that the validity of proceedings in Parliament and state legislature cannot be called into question into any court. This is mainly to ensure the immunity of the members of the legislature from the judicial intervention. Further, Article 53 and 154 provides that the executive power of the union and the state shall be vested with president and governor respectively, and they enjoy some immunity from civil and criminal liability. Now, having discussed the constitutional articles, let's understand the significance of the concept as a whole. Firstly, separation of power protects the rights and liberties of the citizens. It ensures the distribution of power among various organs of the state. The idea here is to prevent the potential abuse of power. Further, it provides for functional specialization. Now, what is meant by functional specialization? For example, expertise of legislature, as we know, lies in making laws. On the other hand, specialization of judiciary lies in checking upon the constitutionality of the laws. Also, the doctrine helps in minimizing the conflict among various organs of the state and to provide the immunity to the legislators. It also ensures the judicial independence. Now, let's understand the concept of functional overlap. Many a times, these three organs which we have discussed carry out functions which is generally considered within the purview of other, and this leads to the concept of functional overlap. How Indian Constitution provides for functional overlap? Let's see. In India, we know that executive is not separate from the legislature. Rather, executive is an integral part of the legislature. Further, legislature also exercises some executive functions. Legislative powers are also exercised by the executive. For example, President of India issues ordinance when the parliament is not in when the parliament is not in session basically. Similarly, delegated legislations are made by the executive, which includes bylaws and regulations, etc. Executive also affects the functioning of the judiciary. How? By making appointments to the office of Chief Justice and other judges. Similarly, legislature also exercises some judicial powers. For example, in case of breach of privileges or while deciding upon the impeachment of judges, legislature is doing nothing but exercising their judicial powers. Similarly, judiciary also also act as a legislature, especially under Article 142, which is also referred as judicial activism. Also, when judiciary is making laws regulating its own conduct. With this, I hope you understood the concept of functional overlap. Now, let's try to understand what is meant by system of checks and balances. It is important to note that though the Indian Constitution provides for separation of power, but it is not strict in nature. It provides for a system of checks and balances as well, which is to prevent any potential abuse of power. The Constitution provides for these checks and balances through various provisions. For instance, when we talk about judiciary and executive, judges of Supreme Court and High Court are appointed by the executive, while they can be removed by the president only after the impeachment process in the parliament. Similarly, legislature also keeps a checks on executive. How? By question hour, no confidence motion, parliamentary committees, etc. And also we know that judiciary keeps a check on the laws made by the parliament and actions taken by the executive. This is nothing but the judicial review. This is how the system of checks and balance are provided in our Indian Constitution. Now let's go through some relevant Supreme Court judgments. Supreme Court in Keshwanand Bharti case 1973 held that the doctrine of separation of power is part of basic structure of Indian Constitution. Also, in Rajanarayan case 1975, Supreme Court observed that in Indian Constitution there is separation of power, but that is in broad sense only. A rigid separation of power as under American Constitution does not apply to India, which we have already understood. To conclude, we can say that the doctrine of separation of power plays a vital role in fair government. It is essential for the effective functioning of the democracy. With this, we will end our discussion on this topic. And in the end, I want you to attempt a UPSC PYQ mains question. You can find the PDF of the topic on our Telegram channel, link of which is given in the description below. Thank you all for watching this video and have a nice day.